with us today is Kyler Sherman-Wilkins. I'm very pleased to have Kyler visiting with us virtually. Kyler is, excuse me, Assistant Professor of Sociology and a faculty affiliate in the Gerontology program at Missouri State University, where he also directs the Health Equity Research Collective, or HERC. Kyler's work examines social and structural determinants of health and health inequities, particularly as they pertain to cognitive health across the life course. And that's actually how I first came across Kyler's work, was writing a proposal to NIA looking at educational inequality in cognitive aging. And there was Kyler's work, which was super duper helpful, which we'll hear more about. So Kyler's work also includes the ways neighborhoods shape life course outcomes, particularly with respect to cognitive aging. And as I said, how race and education together shape risk of cognitive impairment in later life. Today's topic will be, is education the great equalizer? Examining racial and ethnic disparities in returns to education on adult health. So Kyler, thanks again for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. Can everyone hear me? Got a new mic, so I'm trying to make sure it's, oh, great. I'm very honored and humbled to be here. As Eric mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Missouri State University. I must admit that when I got the initial invite, my imposter syndrome kicked in quite a bit. I'm at a regional comprehensive university where we value teaching and service and public-facing sociology. So it was really great to know that this work is being recognized, and it was really great to get the invitation to be at Wisconsin-Madison and talking to you all. So I really am humbled by the invitation. Thank you so much. So yeah, my presentation is titled, Is Education the Great Equalizer? Examining Racial and Ethnic Disparities and Returns of Education on Adult Health. And just to give you a sense of where I want to go today, I like to start my talks by talking about my why. I think that sometimes when we're studying, especially when we're studying health disparities, we forget, as demographers, we forget that we're studying people. And I'd like to ground my work and my perspectives in my why, and explaining why I do what I do. And then shifting over to talk about theoretical underpinnings of some of this connection between education and health, before switching over and looking at some of the evidence that we have currently that suggests that there are different returns of education on health and well-being across the life course. And then shifting over to my own work, which Eric mentioned at the top, the case of cognitive aging, specifically cognitive impairment, and talking about that project, and then ending with some concluding thoughts, including discussions of where I see myself going in the future, along with my really talented and gifted undergraduate students working with me. And then hopefully have some time for a Q&A. I tend to ramble a bit, but I have this talk contained to about 45 to 50 minutes, and I'm hoping that we can get into some discussion toward the end. I make sure that we have some time for that. And also, if you have questions, I'm not going to be monitoring the chat too much. So I don't know how you do this in the past, but if you want to, I don't mind being interrupted. So if you do have a question that's really pressing, feel free to interject with a question. And if not, we can wait until the end. It's whatever's comfortable with you all.
Kyler, you want me to track the chat for you?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with my why. So these two images are of two women who are very important to me. The first, with the 80 and fabulous sash, is my grandmother, who recently passed. She passed in March of 2021. And then my mother right there, who is currently still alive. And I mention them because not only are they responsible for me being here, but they really instilled in me the value of education. And growing up, I was led to believe, and I still do believe, that education is a really important and powerful ticket out of poverty, out of poor health, et cetera. And so I wanted to start with them because they certainly do inspire me every day, and they are the reason I do what I do. However, one of the things that I had noticed as I was getting older and as I was interacting with my peers at undergrad, where I went at Cornell and at Penn State, and talking to professors and just interacting with people of color, highly educated people of color, I began wondering whether or not education really was, or the promise of education was really being fulfilled for all people, regardless of their race and ethnicity. And I'll give you an example, woman who's not pictured, actually my aunt, who retired not too long ago from the Human Resources Department. She was the manager of human resources for Fermilab. For those of you not familiar, Fermilab is a high energy physics research laboratory in Batavia, Illinois, really close to Chicago. Though she was in a position of power and authority and had a high level of education, her health and well-being suffered quite a bit. And when I talked to her about the ways in which, why do you think your health is suffering so much? Why are you so stressed out and all these different things? She revealed to me that being a Black woman exerting authority and having to prove that you're educated time and time again could lead to a certain high level of stress. And it really stuck with me, this idea that, and of course, coupled with reading some work from Tatiana Podrovska and her work on high authority women, for example, led me to think more seriously about how does education, authority, all these different things that we think of as being protective factors, how might they operate differently across race and ethnicity? And more importantly, why? I'm going to shift over and now talk about what I see as one of the guiding lights in my research and how I just approach the world, and that's the intersectionality paradigm. And because it's Women's History Month, I think it's really important and appropriate to talk about Sojourner Truth, who is credited with giving this speech in 1851 at the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. And I'll go ahead and read it for you. That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of all sewed off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? And this speech really does articulate this idea of intersectionality, right? The idea that Sojourner Truth's womanhood, right? The experience of being a woman was conditioned and shaped by her race, but also her broader context in historical time, namely being born an enslaved woman, right? And so when thinking about how these social locations, whether it be gender, or race, or class, condition one another, that's really at the heart of the intersectionality perspective. Now, of course, we probably know about intersectionality more formally through the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who essentially argued that we can think of people as being these complex systems, and we can think of the intersections of identities and social locations as emergent properties. That is to say that we cannot simply create an index of oppression. So we can't just count up people's different social locations and say, okay, X number are advantaged states, X number are disadvantaged states, and create some kind of index. Instead, we have to think of it as these interrelated, kind of synergistically interacting effects on one another. I like to, when I talk about this to my students, I tend to give the example of a bicycle. And so if we take a bicycle, break it down to its constituent parts, we get a handlebar, we get pedals, we get wheels, et cetera. Not really useful on their own, but when we put it together, we get this emergent device, this vehicle that we can use to drive from point A to point B, right? And so we can think of people as being very similar, that we're more than just the sum of our parts. We're actually, there's a novel new thing that emerges when we intersect all of our parts together that makes me Kyler, makes Eric, makes Alicia, right? So So that's where I like to start from, right? Everything that I view when I conduct my research or think through issues, I usually start from this intersectional perspective and trying to understand better how various different social locations might influence our lived experiences differently. I will say that a lot of this work, at least earlier in the framing and foundational literature, has been theoretical and then qualitative, but increasingly quantitative analysts have been employing this particular perspective in their work, right, through the use of interaction terms and stratified models. All right. So in continuing this idea of intersectionality and kind of moving it more formally to empirical analysis, there are two competing hypotheses that I came across relatively early. And this is actually work that I'll be presenting a little bit later in the talk, a work that was done in collaboration with Amy Thierry, who I believe is joining us today as well. So one is the minority poverty hypothesis, and the other is the diminishing returns hypothesis. And these two hypotheses are kind of adjacent to intersectionality in the sense that they are arguing that the effects of these protective factors, in this case, socioeconomic status, of which education makes up a part of it, how they might have different effects for people based on race specifically. And Farmo and Ferraro in their work employ or use these perspectives or test these hypotheses rather to see which one plays out more accurately when it comes to adult health. The minority poverty hypothesis would predict that disparities in health are widest at lowest ends of SES, but decline as one moves up the SES ladder. And so the returns of, say, SES or education are actually greater for people of color, right? Is the argument. Now this has some, basis. I wouldn't call Lyndon B. Johnson a scholar or a social scientist, but he was credited with stating that poverty looks different for Black and white Americans. And I think that this kind of captures the idea that the way that African Americans experience poverty is different. Right. We also have what's referred to as the diminishing returns hypothesis, which would predict that the disparities are widest at higher levels of SES. And this reflects a process in which the returns of education or the returns of wealth or whatever protective factor you're thinking of diminishes as you get up. Right. And for example, this might explain this would explain, for example, the work done by Collins and David, which shows that African-American women of higher SES, higher education levels, deliver low birth weight babies at greater rates than white women with a high school education, right? So the returns of education are very different. Similar type of process may occur, as I mentioned, the paper by work by Podrovska, which shows that higher status women tend to have negative impacts to their health and well-being, which could be a result of these diminishing returns of these so-called protective factors, right? So these two hypotheses really were something that I was interested in testing, specifically as it pertained to cognitive health, which is something that I've been looking at since graduate school with my dissertation, right? So we know then, so guided by these two perspectives, I essentially have been focusing on a central question for a little bit of time now, and that is, does education provide the same benefits to health across race and ethnicity, right? I do acknowledge the gender piece too, and that's something that I am also thinking through as well, but I want to focus this talk specifically on differential returns across race and ethnicity. But we can also imagine that if we include gender, if we include age, if we include sexual orientation, gender identity, then we may also see these play out very differently across these groups. And I think that's a challenge for future work, which unfortunately hasn't really been addressed as much given data limitations. And I think also just the lack of application of this particular perspective to the study of health and well-being. All right. So there's quite a bit of work showing this relationship between education and health. Ross and Wu in their ASR piece, American Sociological Review piece, talk about the various ways in which education may actually channel into better health, right? So it may have benefits in terms of the market. We're able to find better jobs, also just learn health behaviors, right? And essentially we see education as a way to increase our ability to mobilize resources to better our health in the case that we are negatively impacted by some kind of stimulus. And so this is something that has been well established. We also know that education does not operate the same across race and ethnicity. So I talked about a few anecdotal examples. I talked about the two competing hypotheses that were tested by Farrow and Farmer, but we see that this also plays out, in studies ranging from suicide attempts by Azari, of course, Collins Jr. and David with their landmark paper on birth weight among Black and white women of various different levels of education. Garcia's work focusing on cognitive impairment or dementia. And of course, Kimbrough and her colleagues looking at overall health. So we see this playing out empirically. It's not just merely theoretical. There's actually some empirical evidence that suggests that education doesn't have that same protective role across groups of race and ethnicity. And I think the other thing, and this is actually some of Eric and his colleagues' work on the aspects of education that matter for health and mortality. And I think this is a really important piece, as was noted in their work, and I think this is absolutely true. There has been a disconnect between the sociology of education and medical sociology and health demography that really focuses on the why of education and the how of education. Right? I'm guilty of this too. I throw educational attainment in my models and I look at the direct effects of educational attainment without really paying a lot of attention to the why. Right? And so I think that this is really important. I would also think, and I think it's important to acknowledge this, that the aspects of education that matter for health and mortality, those different aspects may matter differently for certain groups than others, right? So if we think about education mattering, or the aspect of education in terms of increasing our human capital, that may matter more for a certain racial group than others, versus the aspect which includes, better access to social networks that might be more beneficial for certain groups than others. So there's a lot of space, a lot of unanswered questions about the aspects of education and how those different aspects may relate differently to health and mortality, depending on one's racial and ethnic group membership. So a lot of really cool, exciting questions. So if you're looking for an answer at this talk, you will not get an answer. You'll get a lot more, future directions and unanswered questions, quite frankly. And we see this consistently, this benefit of educational attainment for Black adults. As I mentioned before, Asari looked at suicide attempts, and though it's important to note that suicide attempts and ideation tends to be higher among white men in particular, right? We don't really think of suicide attempts as being an issue for Black men in particular. Nonetheless, Azari shows us amongst patients who were actually dealing with mental health crises or emergency room settings for acute psychiatric disorders, he found that educational attainment is less protective against future suicide attempts for non-Hispanic Black patients relative to non-Hispanic white patients. So a clear example of how the protective effects of education are going to be less beneficial or less impactful for non-Hispanic Black patients. As I mentioned again, this is an example I use all the time because I think it's just so striking, but educational attainment is less protective against delivery of low birth weight babies for Black women relative to white women. You've seen this borne out across the board. Collins and David's original work looked at Chicago, but we've seen this replicated using larger non-community based or more nationally representative samples as well. And then we also see this in terms of ideal cardiovascular health, right? So Johnson and colleagues in the Journal of the American Heart Association, it's a new paper, hot off the press, looked at educational attainment and a measure of ideal cardiovascular health using data from NHANES, which I'm not going to get into the details too much here, but if we have time at the end, I can certainly talk about how they created this ideal cardiovascular health measure. And I'm actually going to highlight this work more thoroughly, right? So what Johnson et al. Found, so this is this figure looks at odds ratios, right? So for belonging in the ideal category for cardiovascular health. And we see different groupings based on race and ethnicity. We have non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, Hispanic, and Asian. The dotted line represents an odds ratio of 1, meaning that there is no difference, right? No advantage of education for belonging in the ideal cardiovascular health. And by the way, this measure includes things like physical activity, other types of biomarkers that might indicate that someone is in better health cardiovascularly. And what we find is that the only group in which we see clear, the highest benefit of education are among non-Hispanic whites, right? We do see some protection for non-Hispanic blacks, but only when we get into the higher levels of education relative to less than high school education. And then for Asian respondents, we see relatively little protective effects of education. And so this is just another empirical example that highlights this idea that the protective effect of education may operate differently across race and ethnicity. Right? So given these findings, when Dr. Thierry and I turned our attention to cognitive aging, we were expecting a case in which the effects of education would be less protective, frankly, for Black older adults, especially as it pertains to cognitive aging specifically. And so what we set out to do is examine the ways in which education may impact risk for cognitive impairment and how this might look different across race and ethnicity. So this probably comes as no surprise, just as education is important for overall health. Education matters quite a bit for cognitive functioning as well. The mechanisms are I think, still being studied today. It's not as simple as people might think, though there is some evidence that education tends to contribute to better cognitive reserve. And for those unfamiliar with cognitive reserve, the idea here is that cognitive reserve kind of explains the heterogeneity that we might see in the severity of cognitive aging or cognitive impairment by virtue of as it is influenced by these neurodegenerative type of processes or environmental insults. So basically, individuals who have higher levels of cognitive reserve might be able to sustain more insult than those with less, and may be able to maintain cognitive ability despite being in highly stressful or experiencing neuropathology. And so there's reason to believe that education may increase that base level of cognitive reserve. Though some of the work by Wilson and his colleagues, Lisa Barnes and her colleagues out at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center calls into question the true value of cognitive reserve, but I'm not going to get too much into that unless you want to at the Q&A. But at least theoretically, cognitive reserve is seen as being something that protects and that education kind of channels into that higher levels of cognitive reserve. We also see stark disparities in cognitive health across race and ethnicity. And I want to give a special shout out to the work by Lisa Barnes and her colleagues, she's done amazing work in Chicago, recruiting African-American older adults. For a variety of reasons, the relationship and trust levels between African Americans and medical institutions and scientific institutions has been low, and Lisa has really done a lot of work to help to increase that level of trust and to allow us to really understand much more about cognitive aging and Alzheimer's risk among African Americans specifically. And so I think it's really worth noting that we know a lot about racial and ethnic disparities in Alzheimer's and cognitive aging because of the work of Lisa Barnes and her colleagues. And of course, Gleamore and Manley also have really great work that show how the disparities in cognitive aging play out across the life course. And so how early life experiences and early life exposures that are also conditioned on race lead to these longer term cognitive aging trajectories, right? And then the other piece that is important is that Barnes and Wilson, these are both researchers out at Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, have found that education may offer different levels of protection, specifically as it pertains to cognitive functioning writ large. And when we entered this space of research, we noticed that there had not been a lot of work that focused specifically on cognitive impairment specifically, right? So we've seen cognitive trajectories, we've seen overall cognitive functioning, and Amy and I were interested in understanding how does this impact cognitive impairment specifically. So what we set out to do is to test both the minority poverty and diminishing returns hypothesis as it pertains to cognitive impairment. And we did this by drawing on data from the 2012 wave of health and retirement study, yielding in a sample size of 8,093 participants. And we divided between non-Hispanic, white older adults, non-Hispanic, Black older adults, and Mexican Americans, because we wanted to get that race and ethnicity piece as well. A lot of research shows Black-white differences. We wanted to also include ethnicity. And we chose as our we used cognitive impairment as our dependent variable. And I don't know how many of you familiar, well, you probably are familiar with HRS. This is a Demography for Health and Aging working group. So I think that preaching to the choir this, I could sing HRS's praises all day, but I will spare you. But we used the dichotomized measure constructed from the modified TICS. It's a telephone interview for cognitive status, and this measure scales ranges from 0 to 35. It includes a variety of different cognitive tasks. So, for example, it includes immediate word recall. So the interviewer will list several words and then have you recall those words right away. There's also delayed recall, in which the interviewer will wait several minutes and then say, "Hey, you remember those words that I ask you to remember, can you recall them again?" So that would get in, of course, into memory. There are also orientation types of tasks. So calling for you to tell me the day, tell me the president, the object used to cut paper, which of course would be scissors, the desert plant, of course, cactus, and then also tasks like backward count and serial subtraction. And so serial subtraction would be you take a number, you subtract, say 7, and then you take that number and subtract 7 from that, and you continue to do that. And that's supposed to help measure working memory. Right, so 0 to 35, and usually it's used as this continuous measure to get a sense of overall cognitive functioning. But what we decided to do is dichotomize it. And so we used a cut point of 9. So if you are at or below 9 points on this TICS, then you were classified as being cognitively impaired. And of course, if you were above, you were not impaired. And this type of dichotomy or binary construction was basically informed by previous research. There's been other research that uses this cutoff point to create 3 categories to look at people who are experiencing dementia versus cognitively impaired versus normal cognitive functioning, right? So we relied heavily on previous research for that 9-point cutoff. And of course, because we we care about these things. We did some sensitivity analyses and we found that choosing the 8 versus 9 cutoff wasn't really, didn't make much of a difference. And then for our independent variable, we looked at years of education, which is educational attainment, of course. We looked at race, ethnicity, so the main effects of race, main effect of ethnicity. And then, of course, we were interested in the interaction, right? So the idea that the relationship between education will differ across levels of race. And so we captured that through an interaction term between race, ethnicity, and education. And we also controlled for a number of health behaviors and socio-demographic characteristics, smoking, drinking, BMI, age, of course, sex, household income, and number of chronic diseases, and whether or not they experience some kind of psychiatric episode, and depression using the CESD scale, right? All right, in terms of our analytic strategy, given the binary nature of the dependent variable, we estimated a series of logistic regression models. In model 1, we looked at the direct effects or main effects of race and ethnicity, adjusting for all of the controls that I previously mentioned. Model 2 includes the years of education. So part of what we were also trying to do is really get at whether or not we see mediation versus moderation, right? We also know that a lot of scholarship has shown that even when we account for socioeconomic status, class, education, we still see racial and ethnic differences, but we want to make sure that we test that as well. So it could be the case that the racial disparities in cognitive aging could be explained by education. So model 2 was a way for us to test whether it was a mediation or partial mediation. And then lastly, we included our interaction terms, so that race and ethnicity by education interaction, again, with a fully adjusted model to get at whether or not we found evidence for this differing, either the minority stress or the diminishing returns hypothesis. Of course, a significant interaction term would indicate that the effects of education are different across those categories of race. So here are the results from our logistic regression models. And so as model 1, again, we see the main effect. Significant, right? These are odds ratios. So anything above 1 indicates greater or increased odds. And of course, below or less than 1 would indicate lower odds. So we see that for both Black older adults, Mexican American older adults, they have increased odds of being cognitively impaired relative to their white counterparts. Those serve as a reference category. Model 2 includes education. And what we found was actually, it's the slight attenuation of the main effect for race, specifically Black versus white. And then we found complete mediation for Mexican Americans. And each year of education, it was associated with a 16% lower odds of being cognitively impaired. And so we did find actually a protective effect of education, which is something that we also hypothesized, given what we've seen in previous work. And then lastly, we include our interaction terms. And as we can see, we had both the Black by education and Mexican American by education interactions terms were significant. And so I dread having to interpret interaction terms. So I like to plot them because it makes it much easier to be able to see what's going on. And so this figure shows a plot, and this is specifically looking at predicted probability for non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic Blacks. The x-axis is years of education, and the y-axis is predicted probability. And what we find is that the gaps in cognitive impairment are widest at lower levels of education. And as we move up, and increasing levels of education, that gap diminishes. And we can also see that the returns of education are actually stronger for Black older adults relative to white older adults. And so what this would be in support of then is the minority poverty hypothesis, that there is something about low levels of education that's more impactful to Black older adults relative to their white older adults. And so I don't want to speak for Amy, but I was a little surprised by this, because what we had seen consistently in previous research is actually evidence for diminishing returns, in the sense that as you have higher levels of education, we would expect for it to be less protective for Black respondents relative to white respondents. So this is a bit of a surprise for us. I didn't include the figure for Mexicans, but we actually found diminishing returns was evident for whites relative to Mexicans, right? Mexican Americans, right? And so that's something that we also weren't completely expecting to find, and I thought was really interesting, right? Given, again, what has been done on this particular topic up to date. So we found evidence for the minority poverty hypothesis, specifically as it plays out for Black versus white older adults. And returns of education are stronger for non-Hispanic Black older adults relative to non-Hispanic white peers. So I mentioned this at the beginning, and so I just want to circle back and mention this again and show this, which I read in preparation for this talk, and I thought it was a really interesting paper. But again, and Eric can kind of chime in and sing his praises of his and his colleagues if he wants. But a really important work kind of getting at this idea that we need to move beyond specifically looking at educational attainment and understanding what are the aspects. Are they cognitive skills? Are they non-cognitive skills? Does it increase our belonging to certain social groups that impact our better chances? What is it about education that really does matter? I was thrilled to see that Dr. Wasselman is going to be presenting I think in 2 weeks, right, in the next seminar series, to really get at how does geography play a role in this, right? So growing up and being schooled in the South versus the North. Of course, we know that schools are, even though we're well beyond the passage of Brown v. Board of Education, that schools are not integrated. They're not anywhere where they need to be integrated. So I think there really is this open question of what does education actually mean specifically for African Americans, for people of color, people who are historically excluded from these institutions. So I think it's not particularly a stretch to think or imagine that the various aspects of education might matter differently across these particular groups. So, as I mentioned before, we talk about Brown v. Board of Education at 60, and while we certainly have made progress, I mean, there are some school districts that are just as segregated or more so than they were in the past, and that might really shape the type of educational experiences that pupils receive. We also talk about COVID-19 and how that has had a really drastic impact on schooling, especially among individuals from disadvantaged groups. My aunt's a Chicago public school teacher. She teaches in the West Lawndale community, west side of Chicago, a very economically disadvantaged community. And she has, firsthand knowledge of the various challenges that are facing for her students, right? And so we think about education as being this having a long-term effect on health. So how early life conditions certainly do shape later life health outcomes. I think thinking about how these last 2 years have completely devastated school systems and what that might mean, especially for our most vulnerable students. We also see this in terms of disparities in discipline. And so to me, it's pretty obvious that the experience that our Black students are having in K through 12 schools is going to be very different, especially given the fact that we see they're overrepresented in disciplinary actions. They are more likely to be suspended. They also just miss more days of lesson. So loss of instructional days is higher among African Americans. We also see this controlling for class or controlling for offenses, right? And so they tend to be recommended for suspension or higher, more, I guess, severe types of disciplinary actions than their white counterparts. And this certainly will impact any kind of relationship that education might have on well-being, right? And this is something that I want to bring up because it's something that has gotten me thinking about future projects and kind of thinking about, how do I use the university that I'm at, Missouri State University, as this kind of social laboratory, very much in a similar vein as Du Bois, who very much believed in using the community or the city as a laboratory. So this is just for context, following the George Floyd killing, Missouri State was in the news because there was an admitted student who basically reenacted the killing of George Floyd, the knee on the neck, and recorded it and sent it on social media. It was a big firestorm. And a number of students did not feel comfortable with this admitted student coming to the university. And so, of course, the president of the university, citing free speech, said that, it's our job to basically educate the students. And, we can say what we will about free speech, et cetera, but it really did set off backlash at the university where Black students who were currently enrolled felt unsafe and did not feel they were valued. And it led to this Black at Mo State hashtag, which was really, I think something for people to actually be exposed to, but this is just one selection. My first week as a freshman, this white boy told me, "Have you passed the test yet?" I said, "What test?" He said, and I quote, "They take you outside and try to lynch you. And if you can get out of it, that means you pass and you can attend this school." The historical context of Springfield is really important to note. In 1905, there was a very public lynching that led to this mass exodus of a relatively vibrant Black community outside of the state. So, I think that this certainly connects to, this statement, of course, is reprehensible across the board, anywhere you go. But I think there's a deep history as it pertains to racism and lynching in Springfield, Missouri specifically. And so then there were several tweets that were like this. And what it basically illustrates is that for our Black students in particular, they can't just be here and be students. They have to also suffer all of these insults. On top of that, they're clearly advocating for themselves. So we have to basically be advocates or activists as well. And so how they experience schooling and how schooling impacts them is going to be different by virtue simply of belonging to certain groups that's going to have these added challenges. Though it wasn't the focus of this talk, I think it's also really important to note that trans populations are going through very similar. In Missouri, specifically, there are 5 anti-trans bills that are slated to move through the legislature. And I don't think people are very optimistic that they will, people are not optimistic they will not pass. And so what does it mean to be a trans student, right? In this particular context, the Don't Say Gay bills in Florida, et cetera. So we have all of these examples of these larger, something going on in the larger political world that certainly does shape one's ability to quote unquote just be a student, right? So again, I think this is important context to remind us that when we're looking at education, we need to think very deeply and critically about how it might operate differently across groups and why, right? And what are the policy implications of this, right? So just to switch over and talk about current and future work. So Missouri State is great. It's a regional comprehensive university that really does focus on teaching. And so I am really happy. In the last year, I have founded the Health Equity Research Collective, and these are a group of really talented undergrads. Sophie Arnold is not pictured here. By the way, she was just accepted to Boston University's PhD program in sociology. She'll be working with Debbie Carr, so I couldn't be prouder of her. But one thing, and inspired by the Black at Most State hashtag, inspired by conversations I've had with students, and just hearing, for example, it's really great to see I haven't had a Black professor my entire time of being here. Really, these kinds of things really cause us to think specifically about how does attending a PWI impact the health and well-being of students of color. And so we're currently working on this data collection project. It doesn't tie into cognitive aging, it doesn't tie into later adult health, but what it will allow us to investigate is specifically the ways in which education, specifically schooling at a PWI, might shape the experiences, health and well-being of students of color, right? It's not hard to imagine that if you are in poor health or not doing well, that's going to impact your schooling, right? So it's kind of this vicious cycle. And so we think this is a really important question to investigate. Not only that, but does race salience and race centrality condition the relationship between school context and health? Robert Sellers, he was at Michigan, at least when I read his paper. I don't know where he is right now, but he came up with this multidimensional scale, which I think is a really interesting way to think about the relationship between race. So just as we think about, or we push back on this idea that we just use educational attainment in our models and don't think too much about the aspects of education, I think it's also really important to not just throw race into the model and not think about the various different aspects of race that matter, right? So I know that Taylor Hargrove is doing some of this work by looking at skin color as being a very important piece of race. We know, for example, that there are clear gradients where lighter skin people of color tend to have better outcomes on average than darker skinned folks. The other layer to that is how central is race to one's self-concept, right? And so we can imagine that if someone has high levels of race centrality, that is to say that race is very important to their self-concept, they're likely going to be more sensitive or more impacted perhaps by racial microaggressions, right? They might be more impacted by the larger structural things that are going on, right? And so that's a question I think that we are examining when we look at the effects of being a student of color at PWIs. Because let's face it, Black folks are not a monolith, even though sometimes research forgets that. Demographers are doing a better job at this, but we frankly have to do much better. And so it's, given that they're not a monolith, we do expect and we do see a lot of heterogeneity in health and well-being across these populations. So it's not the case that all students of color are doing poorly at PWIs. And so we're trying to see whether or not this race salience and centrality operates as a moderator, right? Kind of conditioning this impact or the influence of being at a PWI on one's health and well-being. So this is the work that we're currently working on, which I think again is I'm really excited about, and they're really excited about it too, which I think is great. It's really hard to get undergraduates to be motivated about anything. So the fact they're really gung-ho about this research is really inspiring to me. And the other piece I want to mention, I had noted before that discipline issues are really something that, can you see my screen still? I'm sorry. Okay, perfect. So Springfield Public Schools has just created a working group. They review their discipline guidelines every year. And so they invited me to sit on their review panel. And this is really important. And one of the things I love about Missouri State is because it's a public affairs institution, it really does encourage their faculty to be involved with the community in any aspect. And so part of this work is going to be to identify, evaluate and identify school discipline disparities. And the punchline is there are a lot of disparities in Springfield, Missouri. And so one of the questions is, could disparities in school discipline impact the ways in which education shapes later life health, right? And so these are really great, I think, interesting opportunities for us to study this in our community. The superintendent's been really great. Their district's been really great. It's the largest school district in Missouri. And I think that better understanding the ways in which discipline and other types of, experiences of students in the classroom on the ground can certainly help us as we think about how to better measure and better think about the relationship between education and health. So here are my references. And here is my contact information. And so, yeah, it really is a pleasure to present to you. And I look forward to any questions or comments or just conversation in general.
Thanks, Kyler. That was great. You covered a lot of ground, and it's really nice hearing how you're moving forward with these various strands of work. We'll have a meeting later, so I'll have time to talk to you about some of the school stuff. I'm looking forward to that. In the meantime, we do have some time for questions. So if people want to, if you can use the raise hand function, that would be helpful. But if you can't, then jumping in is okay too. Julia.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really fascinating. And I just wanted to ask two questions. One is, so how do you deal with time using the HRS and looking at cognitive function, and you're looking at by education? And I was wondering how you think about sort of maybe a life course perspective and how that would maybe impact or change your findings, thinking about how aging is also a, something that's affected by race education and the interactions. So I was wondering if you could speak about that. And then just thinking about what you just talked about with being a person of color at a PWI, I was curious if you had thought about sort of theories of like high effort coping and how, the idea of like conscientiousness and sort of dealing with stress by like working really, really hard and how that affects maybe your physical health through accelerated aging and thinking about maybe what you'll find in your findings, just thinking like hypothetically, whether or not you'll really find this sort of like health differences. So anyway, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the questions. So speaking of cognitive aging, I might forget, guys. So I might have to ask you to remind me of the question. But so the first question, how do I think about age, right, or time rather, right? And is that right? Okay, so that's a great question. In our paper, we did cross-sectional analysis, right? But one thing that we were thinking about is how does this play out over the long run? So if we were looking at kind of like, as you mentioned, this life course approach, is it the case that we might see these relationships play out differently across different ages, right? So we know that there's a pretty large span of age in the HRS. And so it could be the case that the relationship between education and race may look differently for some cohorts versus others, right? On top of that, it might look differently depending on whether they were schooled in the North versus the South, right? So we did make a lot of assumptions, and I think we ignored a lot of that really rich longitudinal panel data by looking at a cross-sectional analysis. But I think you're spot on, right? I think it would be a mistake to not think about age as being one of those conditioning factors too. And in fact, when intersectionality was first formulated, it really largely focused on race and class and gender, specifically among Black women, women of color more specifically. But in recent analyses or recent theorizing around the topic, age and historical time have been really important pieces to consider as well, right? So that's something that we haven't looked at in our specific paper, but it's certainly something that we are interested in, for sure. And I think it plays a huge role, right, in kind of capturing more of that heterogeneity. In terms of your second question, did I get your first question, by the way? Did I get it? Okay. In terms of second question, so it made me think a little bit of this idea of grit. Is that another way of, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about maybe what we don't necessarily see, what you might not be able to capture in a survey, like what we get from like biomarker data, and we see, oh, this person is clearly going through some sort of high stress situation, but they scored very well with depression and anxiety, scored well. I mean that they don't appear to have, depression or anxiety, yet we see that they have this, grit is, resilience, grit, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. It puts me in the mind of thinking about the ways in which the stress process might manifest differently physically versus emotionally versus, in terms of mental health. These, how multidimensional health really is. We might see individuals have lower levels of, say, depression symptoms, but if you look at their, physical biomarkers, we might see there more. And I think there is some evidence of that. I mean, though it's not necessarily the grit piece, when I mentioned, my aunt and also the work of Podrubska that finds that these high, achieving women tend to have poor outcomes relative to those with less levels of education. It kind of puts me in the mindset of that. Like you have to go above and beyond oftentimes to combat either stereotypes or, these particular attitudes that you should be less than. That make it more stressful, right? We see this today, right? The reality of this with Ketanji Brown Jackson or Ketanji Jackson Brown, I forget the order, the new Supreme Court nominee from Biden, right? And how she's being attacked relentlessly as being the affirmative action pick. I would argue that you'd have to be twice as good as your peers in order to make it to the district court, to make it through Harvard Law School, et cetera, right? So it may manifest as, this need or this perception that you have to work twice as hard or spend more time, right, to get through, just to be taken, just as seriously as your white counterpart. So I think there is some room for that, especially, and I think that's a good thing to look at, right, in our own study, but also just in general future research that tries to capture the effect of education.
All right, Elia.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your work with us today. I really, really enjoyed your presentation. The question that I had for you was, if my understanding was correct, that you were controlling for chronic diseases because you thought that because you argued that they were associated with cognitive impairment, but you as well acknowledged that they could be related to education. That led me to think that they could actually have been mediators of the relationship between education and cognitive impairment. So in light of your interest in the returns to education, I was curious to, if you could say more about why you were interested specifically like in a more direct effect as opposed to a total effect. Thank you.
Sure. So interested in the direct effect of education as opposed to looking specifically at chronic diseases as a mediator. Is that right?
Yeah. So I don't know if I understood it correctly, but I like my understanding was that like education could also shape cognitive impairment through those through those chronic diseases. And I was curious as to why you were not interested in capturing that in your analysis as well.
So when in the adjusted models, I didn't test for a formal mediation, but in the adjusted models, we found that chronic disease certainly did influence, but it didn't really take away or mediate the direct effect of educational attainment on cognitive health. So I think it's just a matter of how we were theorizing about it, and we were very specifically looking at the net effects of education independent of chronic health conditions, right? We certainly could have tested, and I think there's reason to believe, or perhaps that if we did a more formal mediation analysis, we can get at how does education operate through chronic diseases, but that wasn't really the goal of our particular paper.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question that was in the chat. This is from Yua Chin. Yua says, thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. First, could you clarify why you use 2012 HRS rather than other waves or longitudinal data? Second, I'm wondering whether the measures of cognitive function in HRS have different effectiveness or reliability across racial ethnic groups. Is there any study on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to answer the first question, part of it was honestly just, so the question was, why do we choose to use one wave or not future waves or longitudinal waves? Part of it was just a matter of really trying to exploring, so more of an exploratory type of analysis to see how it existed at one point in time, right? So I think one of the benefits of the HRS is the ability to leverage the multiple waves. So that certainly was a shortcoming. But in our particular case, we were using just a cross-sectional study to just see how these relationships play out, right? There have been discussions to look at eventually a event history approach where we look at time for cognitive impairment. That's something that we are interested in looking at to leverage the multiple waves of HRS and to see whether or not the relationship between education and may differ across race when it comes to time to cognitive impairment, right? So again, this event history analysis approach, but that's just something that we haven't done yet, right? It's something that we certainly are thinking about, leveraging the multiple waves. In terms of your second question, I think it's a really important one. That's a great one. So I turn to actually Lisa Barnes's work and the work that's being done out at the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And I know that they have a couple of papers that look at the utility or the how appropriate each of these cognitive measures are across various different races and ethnicities. And they seem to find that all in all, they tend to have a lot of confidence in these global measures of cognition, but what they also do is they break it down in terms of smaller like subsets, right? So they'll look at episodic memory, they'll look at other types of domains of cognition, but they don't seem to find that there are any problems of using these measures across race. I don't know if the same types. That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure. I know that McArdle in his work on kind of classifying the different measures within tics kind of created these classes. So he was able to, justify episodic memory being the immediate and delayed word recall. But I think that's a really interesting question, whether or not those operate the same across race and ethnicity. I think it's going to be just me completely speculating here and thinking through it. When it comes to the recall tasks, for example, we might imagine I think they took great strides to choose words that were not, I guess, for lack of a better phrasing, like culturally dependent. I know that, for example, oftentimes in standardized tests, one of the biases one of the allegations or charges that they are culturally biased, right, with certain words. So they try to use words that I think are pretty, generic or not, we don't have to worry too much about them being culturally dependent. So for the word recall, I think given that it's capturing a relatively objective type of measure in terms of memory, I don't see that as being problematic, but of course it could be, right? And so I'm not familiar with the work, and I think that is an interesting question that I would be interested in learning more about. I don't know if anyone else here on the call knows whether or not it's been tested across race and ethnicity. I don't know the answer to that.
I will say very briefly, so I collaborate with Jen Manley on some work in high school and beyond, who's a neuropsych person. And we're using the standard NIH toolkit set of these measures. We're also doing the immediate delayed recall. And she's never, and a lot of the work is focused on racial and ethnic differences in cognitive aging. And she's never said a word about concerns about that. So that makes me think it's probably pretty kosher, but that's sort of indirect evidence to that point. I'm not aware of any rigorous studies that have looked for like differential item function or any of the usual diagnostics for that, and the tics or any of these other assessments. Doesn't mean they're not out there. Yeah, but that's my sense.
Yeah, that's my take too. But I think it certainly, I mean, I feel like that's probably not an assumption that we necessarily should make. So maybe that rigorous analysis is needed, but to date, I'm not familiar with any of those types of analyses.
Sounds like a good paper waiting to happen. Michal.
Thank you. So thanks for a great talk, Kyler. Really, really interesting. I wanted to go back and maybe hear a little bit more what you had to say about the puzzle that you started with and sort of the expectation, right, that in other health measures you see, you know, the racial disparities work out differentially in terms of the return to education, and the fact that the cognition cognition results don't fit the pattern that you saw before, right? And so that's really fascinating, right? And makes you wonder about, well, what exactly are the mechanisms that might be at play? Why are things working out in one particular way for physical health outcomes? And, you know, you could tell all kinds of stories, I think, about how education may be more related to cognitive abilities in other ways. Perhaps a more direct pathway exists from education to cognition than from education to cardiovascular disease or something, or something else like that. And so I just wonder if you could, you know, I know you said that this is clearly an area for more research and figuring out what it is about education, but I wonder if you have just additional thoughts to share about why it is that this cognition, which, you know, I also want to stress for people who don't know that this is like really the frontier, right, of where research on health and aging is, because for so long the data to do this work was not available, and especially data on racial disparities and these outcomes weren't available. And even in the HRS, I mean, I think often you do have to go back to earlier waves rather than later, because even when you have a representative sample of African Americans and you follow them over time, differential mortality and selection bias often means that those samples are not large enough in the end to be able to see what you have, right? So it makes sense to me to go back earlier and try to get the larger samples when they're there. But if you could say a little bit more about sort of the why cognition might behave differently and how these potentially competing risks, right, of other health issues and mortality might play into the disparities that you see.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really important question, and you know, I can speculate, but I to your point, it's really fascinating, and I don't know, right? You know, so for me, it was surprising because, you know, as we know more, as we learn more about, and I'm going to say Alzheimer's specifically, dementias, because usually declines in cognitive functioning are, you know, a really robust predictor of later life, you know, or you know, Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementias. And what we know more, what we're learning more and more is that the stress process, some of these same kind of like, you know, processes in which kind of social inequality gets under our skin, there's reason to believe that that also impacts cognitive health just as it does cardiovascular health, right? I know that for a long time, physicians would just say what's good for the brain is, or what's good for the heart's good for the brain, right? Really not really understanding these separate pathways. So it was surprising because I was expecting to see very similar. And so part of what I'm thinking perhaps, and I don't think she's on the call anymore, but the first question about this idea of you know, grit, and how, other types of how people navigate the educational setting, especially if you're from a member of a historically excluded group, could manifest itself differently, right? So this idea that you might see these more objective, negative indicators in terms of biomarkers or cardiovascular disease or physical health types of poor outcomes, but you don't see the same for mental health, right? And so it could be the same thing in which perhaps education, especially and the other thing to realize is that for a lot of these folks, they have fewer years of education, right, on average. And so any type of increase in educational attainment when it comes to cognitive function or cognition, it might be kind of a net benefit, even considering the fact that it may not be the same quality, or they have, a different experience going through the educational setting. So maybe it's that cognition is a bit more robust to kind of those differing effects, or the negative features of higher education that is experienced by people from historically excluded groups. So it could be that domain, cognitive domain, is just more resilient in general, and so it doesn't really have that same type of the conditioning effect of race and ethnicity may not work as well for cognitive functioning. I think it also, though, would depend on how you're assessing cognitive health, right? So if we're using the tics, if we're using some of these measures, I think without excluding the verbal memory, the questions on disorientation, like who's the president, what do you use to cut scissors, I think is unless you're pretty much, experiencing severe dementia, you're probably going to score well on those domains of the cognitive functioning, right? So it may also be one of those things that we're not seeing enough people who are truly in experiencing severe cognitive impairment to kind of get at the true relationship and how it looks differently across education. The other thing I was going to mention in terms of how we measure cognition, the HRS does not include brain scans. There are certain biomarkers of cognitive aging that we just can't capture, or we don't capture in these large data sets, which is why I think the work at what they're doing at Alzheimer's Research Center is so important. And I need to familiarize myself more with their research, but I don't know if they're seeing anything different depending on how they choose, right? So if they're looking at biomarkers of neuropathology, plaques, et cetera, versus some of these, survey measures, I don't know if they're seeing something different play out. But I know those are rambly. I'm kind of like think as I'm answering your question. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's an interesting and fascinating line of inquiry. I wonder if it plays out differently across historical time. So does it look differently for the cohorts of the HRS versus people today? I don't know. I think that might be an interesting thing to think about too. If we think about, and this is going to be anecdotal for sure, but I went to an all-white school, and it was very, very different from some of my peers who went to predominantly Black schools. And so and in some ways it was kind of beneficial, even though I was stressed out all the time, and everything was I felt like everything was a racial slight against me. But there was also this, equality piece that I think was higher than some of the peers that went to these lower funded schools, even though they probably experienced less of. So I don't know. I feel like really focusing on the school context and the context of schooling is really important, and might allow us to kind of can reveal a lot more about how this relationship plays out for physical versus cognitive health. Stress is also, I think, sometimes a good thing for cognitive. I mean, there's some theories about how the stress response can actually cause you to focus more and to be in a heightened sense of, alertness, which on the over the grand, over the long term can be very detrimental, but at least in terms of short term could be perhaps beneficial, right? So does it take longer for that chronic stress to be more adversely related to cognition than it does for cardiovascular health? I don't know.
Thank you.
Another one in the chat for you, Kyler.
Okay.
Francesco writes, thank you, Kyler, for such a great presentation. I really appreciated the graph you showed with the converging curves for black and white to help interpret the interaction term. Just a quick question to better understand how you built your model. Because that graph looked curvilinear, I was wondering if you used a quadratic term or any type of nonlinear function for your years of education variable.
I can't recall. I'm pretty sure we tested for both. I think we included both an age and an age squared term.
I'm sorry, I think it was about the years of education.
Well, yeah, it couldn't have been age because it was cross-sectional. I don't recall, actually. That's a good question. I don't recall whether we looked at a curvilinear year of education treatment.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off that actually, because I had a similar thought. Not so much necessarily about functional form, but not the nonlinearity in terms of a quadratic, but more in terms of the credentials people earn and the implicit assumption that a year gained between 10th and 11th grade is the same as a year gained between 13th and 14th or 16th and 17th. It might be worth, if you haven't, it might be worth going back and thinking, modeling how those nonlinearities might creep in. I'm also thinking of the work that Hayward and Hummer did around functional forms for the education mortality gradient, right?
Yeah.
It's another of the several interesting puzzles I think you're presenting for us.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point. Both you and Francesco raised. I think more increased focus on the functional form and kind of modeling, and point well taken, right? What does a year of education really mean versus like the credential? I think those are really important things to think about, and I clearly haven't thought about them enough. But certainly, I think really important as we try to unravel a bit more about this connection between education and cognition. So absolutely, well taken.
I actually have a related question to that. First, I want to be clear. I'm not saying you're claiming a causal story. So this is not the causal police question. It's going to sound related. When you think about educational attainment, whether in years or credentials, I think you're simultaneously thinking about some of the things I think Julia was pointing you to, and you were talking about grit, for example, and how it might just take that much more to get to each level of education. But you're also talking about an increasingly selective regime in which, historically at least, the differences in grades and in test scores between first gen continuing, between African-American, non-Hispanic white, Latinx, those differences tend to decline across levels of education because there are additional selection mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder, more generally, have you thought about the distinction between what education might be doing as a set of experiences versus what education might be requiring of those selected to higher levels, just as a sort of filtering mechanism?
Oh, that's a great point. I think maybe kind of buried in my discussion of what it takes to get there. Absolutely, it's a selection, and so from what I'm hearing, it's whether or not we actually see a stronger return of education per se, and more there's something about the people who reach that stage who are just more robust, right? And so perhaps are less likely to have lower levels of cognitive impairment, right? So those people who had to reach that stage had to have something about them that was above and beyond just pure educational attainment, right? So kind of, I think looking at social networks would be really important to kind of get at. That's something else I see as being a really important, protective effect, especially among people of color. I know that Orlando Patterson, with his Rituals of Blood, talks specifically about the role of social networks and kin networks in particular for Black folks and having to endure some of the hardships of just being Black in America. So maybe it's that education is capturing just a piece of that larger story of what does it mean to be a Black person who's achieved that high level, right? So I think that selection piece is certainly going on, for sure.
It also, the conversation reminded me, you talked a little bit about Lisa Barnes' excellent work at Rush. There's a nice paper I came across. She and, of course, often these are like a gazillion other people. So she and a gazillion other people, looking at the relationship between education and cognition early in the panel and then cognitive change over the panel. Mm-hmm. And that may be another way to think about it, right? Because they might have different implications. I guess, and this also goes to Julia's earlier point about the panel structure.
Yeah, and it was interesting from what I've seen coming out of that Rush group. They find quite a bit of relationship with, initial cognition, but depending on the question, depending on the predictors, they don't find as much of that for cognitive change. And so I think that's another important thing. And a part of it could also just be the scale, time frame. But we see a lot of action, quite frankly, at initial cognition, right? Not so much different rates of change. And that can get running protect, that can get the idea of people higher. No, I was just saying that could be indicative of that selection effect kind of going into play, right? Yeah.
So we're running low on time. I want to see if anybody else has any questions they want to get in before we run out. I have one more I'd like to ask, but I don't want to jump the queue if anybody else has anything. So just on the tics and the threshold setting, Kyler, I wonder if that's pegged to other studies that have a sort of diagnostic outcome of dementia, or whether you just played around with thresholds and located that one as useful?
No, yeah. So it was based on, so there was another paper that looks at, so it was they estimated multinomial logistic regression models to predict membership in either the dementia versus mild cognitive impairment versus, cognitively intact, for lack of a better phrase. So there are papers that we modeled that on. We didn't just create our own threshold. That said, we did also we test a cut point of 8 and I believe 10, just to make sure that, we did our due diligence in terms of sensitivity. But that was based on previous research. And I can forward that to you, or I can, if I find it, but
that would be super helpful. Yeah,
that's something that we were, because we wanted to make sure that we could actually do it in a theoretically, empirically sound way, and that we can justify. So we relied on previous research that looked at that.
Well, yeah, and I'll follow up with you in our one-on-one.
Sure, yeah.
So for now, let's thank Kyler for an excellent talk. Really appreciate you joining us today, Kyler.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
And why don't you stay on for just a moment? I want to make sure you have the Zoom link for your one-on-one meetings.
Okay.
And then I'll make you host on those when they start.
Okay, sounds good.
So interesting, this work. I'm like on a steep learning curve.
Well, I mean, I am too. And I will say this is really great because, typically, this is in no way a way of knocking my university, but we don't get a lot of chances to kind of discuss these ideas at a higher level. So this was really a great time to revisit some of the work and get some of those questions that I would expect to be asked by people who are, researchers, right? First and foremost. So it's been really nice to have that experience, though. I will say it was kind of nerve-wracking, but it was good. Really great work. I think it's really interesting stuff. I'm passionate about it. So I enjoyed it.
You had a great room. I mean, I don't know if you looked who was in there, but like Paulo Gilsans showed up. Alberto Poloni was there.
Oh, which also caused my heart rate to go up. It's like I cited these folks in my comps. Oh my gosh. So
yeah. No, it was a good turnout.
A cupcake.
Is he really?
No. No, he is not. No.
But I've only known him since he's been emeritus, so he's very nice to me.
I can tell you, when I was a graduate student, he was no cupcake, but as a colleague, he's more cupcake-ish.
So Eric Leafia is the first person. So do you
Okay.
want me to get on and make Kyler host?
That would be awesome.
And
If
then
you
it can
could,
just
yeah.
keep going. So you've got a break for about a half an hour.
Okay, so I have until 1:30?
Yep.
Is the first, okay, so I can just leave, should I?
Yep. You leave this because it's a different link.
Okay, perfect, sounds good.
And then you'll just be on for, I think there's 4 people.
Okay,
Yes, and you'll be done at 3:25. Eric is your second meeting.
okay.
Do you want us to resend that link, or do you have it, Kyler?
Can you just resend it just to be
Yep,
safe?
and I sent it in your calendar also.
Oh, perfect.
But
That's awesome.
I can check and just double check that you got it.
Okay, yeah.
So
That sounds perfect. Just so you know, just Eric, and we can talk about it more. Crimmins and Hayward, they both have papers where they use that cut point. One in JHSB 2016.
Okay.
So
Yeah, part of why I'm thinking it through, Kyler, is we've got the 88 in high school and beyond.
mhm.
And I'm having this conversation we're working on the first paper with some preliminary data looking at that and at various educational things. And I'm going back and forth with a colleague who's trained as an epidemiologist who's going to be lead on it. And epi folks love the cutoff. And I'm always like, you're throwing away a lot of information. You sure you want to do that? So that's helpful.
No, yeah, that's what the discussion that we had too, because we were trying to figure out how can we carve out, because people have been doing this, looking at cognitive aging more broadly, cognitive functioning more broadly. But we wanted to specifically look at, and my colleague Amy, she's epi, she's a public health person, so she won that fight, quite frankly.
Yeah, and ours is early on. I have some positional advantage as a PI on the study. but I don't feel inclined to throw it in. I want to see how it plays out. I'm happy to look at it both ways and figure out how to report it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll give you a little break. I will see you a little later this afternoon.
Okay, sounds good. See you later.
Bye, Kyler.
Bye.